Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be an overview of my week in reading, which normally would have been a Friday Reads, but I didn't get around to filming this on Friday. It's still National Poetry Month, so a good chunk of what I read was poetry. I am going to start with something that's
not that.
And that is a memoir off of the Canada Reads list, Jessie Thistle's From the Ashes. The subheading is My Story of Being Métis, Homeless, and Finding My Way. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Jessie Thistle himself, which I think is compellingly read. I think the subheading on this one is a little misleading because the cultural and the kind of finding my way element are really minimal. That is maybe the final couple of chapters in the book, maybe the last hour or so of the audio. It is very focused on this period of homelessness, which lasted more than a decade and involved a lot of addiction. And the other elements are really, really minimal and just kind of bookend the story. There are some bits and pieces about his early childhood, which interestingly, as I was listening to it, I didn't feel it was clear that this was his very early childhood. It seemed like we were following him up until about the age of 8, when he and his brothers ended up in foster care, but then it turns out that no, that actually happened when he was 3. There's a lot of confusion to the style of the timeline, which when you are in the homeless addiction major segment of it makes sense, because he says himself in the afterword that a lot of his memories aren't necessarily the best of that period. In any case, at the age of 3, he and his brothers went into foster care. There was an abusive situation, and his paternal grandparents eventually take them in, and he gets to a certain point in his teenage drug use that his grandfather eventually kicks him out. One of the interesting things that isn't really delved into in this is that his brother, who obviously grew up in the same environments, became an RCMP officer at the same time. And there's one point when he is in Vancouver that his brother just kicks him out of the house because he's doing things like stealing his brother's police ID. So I almost wish there had been more of that, of how the brothers reacted to their environments differently, but there isn't. That's just not the story that's being told here. But it did catch my attention, and I wish there had been more of that, which is maybe not fair. I think what's interesting about the homelessness section is that I think there's a stereotype when you listen to addiction stories that there will be a single moment of hitting rock bottom. And in this, there are actually multiple moments where, because that's such a common storytelling thing to fall into, I fully expected that to be the moment that he turns his life around, and it wasn't. He has multiple moments. There's a moment where he gets raped in a club. There's a moment where he and a friend are living in a car in Vancouver, and then someone steals their clothes out of the car. There's a moment where he ends up jumping off a building and crushes both his wrist and one of his ankles. There's a moment where he's in prison and starts getting an education, and you think that's the turnaround moment, and it isn't. So it's fascinating. It plays with the trope and makes the point that that may be the cliche of how this kind of narrative should go, but clearly that wasn't true to his life. So that's an interesting thing to read, to have my expectations kind of thwarted, because obviously I know that he's a university lecturer, and now I know that his life is back on track. And so I expected that to start a lot earlier in the book, and it doesn't. So I think the subheading on this does it a disservice, because I did spend so much of this waiting for the turnaround point, when the turnaround point is really almost an epilogue to the bulk of this, which is the homelessness story. So I think I went in expecting something different from what this was, because it is definitely not culturally focused or finding my way focused. It is very definitely a memoir of homelessness and addiction. And I think it was powerful for that, but I think because of the subheading, I was definitely expecting something different. So I think this is definitely worth reading or worth listening to, but go in with the right expectations, because it was not the style of narrative that I expected based on the subheading. So next up, I read A History of Clouds by Magnus Enzensberger. This was translated from German by Martin Chalmers and Esther Kinsky. And the poems are presented basically in alternating translations and are not presented with the original, which I think is a flaw in poetry, because if you don't have any way of looking at the original rhythm of the language, because even if you don't speak the original language, you would be able to see how the words flow on the page, and I think the lack of that damaged my ability to appreciate some of this. A lot of this is commentary on modern life. Some of it does feel like old man yells at cloud. which some of that is clearly not an issue of the translation. There is one poem in here that, for example, this is called Motivational Research. Unfortunately, I have no choice but to kill you, because you refuse to speak Basque, because the bank has blocked my overdraft, because of Daddy, because I can't bear the sight of unveiled women, because the rich get on my wick, for the sake of the dear Lord, because you won't give me any money for the next shot, because you're not Catholic enough, / much too Catholic, because I'm offended, because of Mummy, because you're looking at me funny, because I ticked the wrong boxes in the exam and failed, because I hear voices, and anyway, just because. I thank you for your time. Tick as applicable before taking action. And that's one of the ones that was translated by Martin Chalmers. So with something like that, I both think it's kind of funny, but at the same time it does sound a little poking at people, and it's fine, but I didn't feel like that was that impressive. Now, I mentioned that was one of Chalmers' translations because I felt that Kinsky's translations were much more neutral style of English, whereas Chalmers' translations were much more English, which is funny because he's actually Scottish and from Scotland. Whereas I felt like it's hard to not read his translations in a kind of estuary accent. And I thought that was odd because they shouldn't sound English. If you're translating this into English, it should be a generic, stripped of dialect kind of English. Unless there's like playing with dialect within German that he's trying to replicate in English, but that didn't seem to be the case. It was just a choice that he'd made that I thought was odd, but again, hard to judge when you can't see the original. So this was fine, but yeah, I was frustrated by it. It checked a box in terms of readathons because I had started the year planning to take part in the Read German Books 2020 that Mel and Britta are doing, and I kind of fell off on that. So now I'm back on. Next up, I read another collection of poetry that checks a readathon box. Different readathon this time. This time it's Aussie April, which is reading Australian books. And this was a book that I saw Olivia from Olivia's Catastrophe talking about. She's based in the Netherlands. She's not Australian, but she did just spend a year in Australia. So she's been talking about quite a few Australian titles, and I thought, that sounds like something I will enjoy. I'm going to pick that up. And that was Omar Sakr's The Lost Arab. This is a semi-autobiographical collection of poetry that deals primarily with identity, mostly about Arab-Australian identity, although it plays with some Turkish-Australian identity, maybe, but it seems peripheral. He has a Turkish grandmother, but most of his family is Lebanese, as well as issues surrounding things like sexuality and neighborhoods. And I was surprised by how unfamiliar a lot of this felt, because in general I think of, and in my experience, I have a kind of idea of, as much as everybody, you know, gets nationalistic and has historical issues with each other, a lot of Eastern Mediterranean immigrant culture is ultimately pretty similar, even if we don't all like to admit that all the time. And a lot of Australian culture does feel very similar to Canadian culture, just because there is that same British Commonwealth settler state kind of background. But this did feel very unfamiliar despite those two things, so I thought that was really interesting. And it was unexpected, because I think I went into this thinking this will be familiar, but in this slightly different situation, and it was very unfamiliar, which I appreciated. That was really interesting stuff. Because it is poetry, I will read you some of it. This one is called This Is Not Meant for You. I tore this page from somebody else's book. It was written in Arabic, so I found a man to lend me his tongue. Left the page splotched with his thickness and the following words. This was never meant for you. Your grandfather made that choice, and you live with the ashes of it black on your teeth. The Uber driver asked me where the local mosque was, real casual, like he didn't already know. I had it folded up in a square and carried it everywhere. It was one of those nondescript places with a plaque, the kind you need to get close to read the inscription. This is not meant for you. I tried once to swallow a prayerful palace, but got gum stuck on minarets. These stones can't be hidden in a body. Everyone knows where they are. The driver releases me onto Sydney Road, a replica of home. All the lead bread, smoke, and men. I try not to see my father in them, but he is there no matter where I look. Laughing with the ease of a man never pierced by a minaret. In each gaping mouth I witness an old disaster, a rank tooth, a cavity holding captive my name. And I'd say the style is relatively consistent, even though there are a couple of poems in there that have the in the style of or in response to as part of them. So it is very particular in a way that I didn't expect, but I thought was interesting. So I appreciated having read this because I like being surprised like that. I think it's always good to go into something thinking you know what you're going to get and getting something very different. So I appreciated that. Next up, I read a poetry collection that checks a box for yet another readathon, and that was Jillian Weise's Cyborg Detective. And the readathon that fits the theme of is the Disability Readathon, which is still ongoing at this point. Jillian Weise, if you haven't read her work, she plays a lot with the idea of mobility equipment as being part of cyborg identity, and then people who claim to be cyborgs because they're attached to their phone are triborgs. I will link below to an interview that she did with Alice Wong from the Disability Visibility Project, and it gives some context to the whole idea that she's playing with in this. I thoroughly enjoyed this collection of poetry, but at the same time, I think there is a large percentage of this that is referencing other works of art and other poetry from artists that I wasn't familiar with, and while there are endnotes that tell you what the references are, it does feel like it has a really narrowly specific audience. Possibly even that she's just writing this for herself. So for example, there's one poem here called 10 Postcards to Marie Howe. This is apparently a reference to an art exhibit in which the artist did interviews with blind people on beauty, and in an effort to make their exhibit more accessible, had Braille labels printed, but nobody paid attention to that and they were printed upside down. Now, I hadn't known about that when I read this poem, so reading it, it seemed a lot more general, and I think it works as something general because it feels more general because this is something that happens constantly. Like if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. and seen the FDR memorial, there's giant Braille on all of the monuments, but it's too big for someone to actually read. So it's a visual cue. It's essentially pretending to be accessible. I'm getting slightly off topic, but I'll read this poem too. Dear Marie, I just read your poem The Star Market in the New Yorker. Felt like killing myself. Must mean it's a good poem, right? Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, yeah, I get it. Jesus in a wheelchair. Could I bear the look on his face when he wheels around? Is this supposed to make me feel better? I don't want to be Jesus, or a saint, or stuck in your poem anymore. Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, no. Just no. Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, sorry, this isn't productive. Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, what I need is a surrogate to approach you, someone who is your generation, someone who represents the disability rights movement, someone whose name you would recognize, so that person could say, let's have coffee. Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, the feeble, the lame, I could hardly look at them. Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, Sir Philip Sidney, 1554 to 1586, prescribes two emotive responses for the disabled subject in literature, laughing or crying. Your poem has given us the latter. Yours, Jillian. Dear Marie, what's up with the metaphors sour milk, bad meat to describe the disabled? Are you kidding me? Yours, Jillian. And so forth. There's another poem in here that is found poetry, and it's a series of headings from articles in which disabled women were either raped or murdered. But the title is a reference to a set of other poems written by male poets in 2013. So it works on its own because you are looking at this list of horror, but it is actually a specific reference to something else. So this is almost a collection in which I don't know if you'd be better off reading the notes at the end first or flipping back and forth, because I think it all works on its own. But at the same time, the fact that it's also specific makes it feel like it's aimed at a really, really narrow and specific audience, which is interesting. But so that's most of what I've read or listened to lately. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you think of them. If you're taking part in Aussie April or the Disability Readathon or the Read German Books Readathon, I'd love to hear if you read any poetry on those themes, since this is National Poetry Month, so why not combine them? Anyway, I hope you're having a good weekend. That's it for now. Ciao.